Hello, me old mates. How are you doing? Well, I'm prepared for Halloween a few days, and I'm very comfortable in my little cellar here, and I've got my friends like Jonathan Frid, Dark Shadows, and what have we got here? Dracula, Bela Lugosi, lovely poster on Etsy, and a few little friends, and my cat, well, he looks a bit weird, he's 200 years dead, but I can't bury him, so I keep him for Halloween. Housekeeping, of course. My skull, Ukraine skull pipe, 9mm, link below. And of course, with that pipe you have a skull tamper from Larry Blackett. Perfect. And what tobacco, there's so many good Halloween tobacco, but 5 years ago, when I was collecting a lot of tobacco, the last 20% of the tin, you put it in a jar and a mix aromatic, and this jar was filled 5 years. Called it Black Shuck, and that's the first story you will see. Of course, also my lighter is a skull Zippo. Has to be. Everything fits for Halloween. And I watched 2 ghost stories. These ghost stories, I actually loaded them 2 years ago, and I deleted them because there was complaints of copyright music. But in recent times, the BBC is actually forgiving if you link the source and YouTube and you're not monetized. So I decided to reload these stories, but director's cut, so I've actually shortened them a little bit. They were very long at that time. So anyway, it's a short intro, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Half of my subscribers didn't see it. There were, before I was maybe, I don't know, 700 subs at that time, so I thought it was actually justified to reload these videos, and not for the squeamish, true stories from me. Anyway, enjoy this ghost story for Halloween. we go back to 1978. I was 20 years old, just 1 year into college, very lean and fit, used to do a lot of cycling. Didn't have a lot of money for a luxury bike, but I had one of those nice curled handlebar racers, 5 gears. I like the 5 gears much better in shifting. I thought 10 gears was often your chain would come disconnected and wasn't really necessary. And I had a lightweight alloy bicycle. I bought it second hand from a guy that paid a lot more for the new one, and then it was affordable. I could have this one. I used to sometimes do almost 100 miles in a day, not very often. Typical for me was maybe 40 miles in a day, shorter trips, you know. Well, one autumn I was staying with a friend in Aldeburgh, and his father was actually the vicar there in those days, and we decided to go out a bit cycling. He also used to like cycling as well. And we took a trip up to a place called Leiston Abbey. Leiston Abbey, we would pronounce it there, and it's basically a beautiful ruin of one of these lovely abbeys that was like tragically so much of English church heritage was destroyed by Henry VIII. There are some other events, of course, that are tied around it. I'll leave a link about Leiston Abbey there. It's it was only about 10 miles from Aldeburgh, so we did a kind of round trip and ended up there, and it was quite a fascinating place, and there's lots of beautiful coastal towns. We stopped at one or two to have just a nice pint of beer and admire the scenery, as it were. So it's a lovely part of the Suffolk coast in East Anglia. Now, the legend of Black Shuck is very old. It goes back to 1577, when there was a famous and terrible incident recorded officially in the church records, recorded by Father Abraham Fleming, who was the vicar at Bungay Church. And you see here the record in the original Old English. Basically what it says is it was a horrendous storm that day, with lightning like they'd never seen before, and people had fled to the church for sanctuary, thinking this is some sort of devil's work. But it got worse. A huge dog. We're talking about a dog that stood 6 foot. There's English Mastiffs and Irish hounds, of course, but this dog was enormous. Probably weighed twice as much as a normal man, at least. And this dog pushed its way into the church and attacked some of the parishioners in the congregation, and at least 3 people were killed in that incident, and 2 others, I think, seriously injured at a second incident at Blytheborough Church, not far away. And in Blytheborough Church, we see here, the hound pressed its paws against the church door and burned these paw marks into the door and clawed down. These marks are still to be seen today for all to see. You can dispute or question how they came to be there, but that's the story of Black Shuck. Now, the story goes back even further, and basically this dog has terrorised all of the East Anglian counties, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, and there are many terrifying hounds of hell stories in British folklore, of course, in other counties, and then the Hound of the Baskervilles in Sherlock Holmes and so forth. There are many of these legends, but one of the most famous and persistent in East Anglia is that of Black Shuck. Now, Shuck is thought to come from an old English word called skúka, and skúka was thought by some to be from the Nordic culture, the Hound of Odin, but that's been disputed by many scholars, and it is basically a legitimate Old English word meaning demon or devil. Well, you say, what? Very interesting, but what's got all of this to do with you and your cycling trip to Leiston Abbey in 1978? Well, as I said, we'd had a few drinks and we ended up at Leiston Abbey at the end of the trip, and my friend said, well, I've got to go back because I've promised to meet with someone, so I can't dally any longer. And I was enjoying the end of the day there. The sun was just going down. There was some nice sunset views to look at. So I told her I'll come a bit later. I'll be probably an hour behind you or something. So off he went, and I laid there on the grass. I didn't smoke back then, and just admired the seagulls and the lovely tones of those red tones as they catch the clouds, and actually sort of dozed a little bit. It wasn't that cold for autumn as it normally would be, and I was sheltered against the wind. One of these old tombstones around Leiston Abbey. So it started to get a bit dark, and I had lights on my bike and everything. I thought I'd better go off now, don't want to be too late back. We hadn't arranged to have dinner. We said we might be back a bit later, so I hopped on my bike and started to take, there were a couple of roads I could have taken. So I decided to take this country road, smaller road, a little bit more scenic even in the dusk light, and it was a bit more sheltered from the coastal road, which would have been quite windy. Just hopped on my bike and set off down the country lanes. Now, I wasn't a competition cyclist, but on some downhill stretches I could get 40 miles an hour out of my bike. It just depended on the terrain. As I said, it was a light alloy bike. I was pretty lean then. I was in university second team, you know, which was nothing special like with my rowing, but you know, gave me a good workout and enjoyed it. A dog, greyhound for example, can go about 42, 45, one of the fastest dogs there is. Some of the bigger hounds can approach 40 miles an hour. Just for information, it becomes relevant very soon. Well, I must have gone 3 or 4 miles, and you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes you have that feeling that somebody's watching you. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and it might be subconsciously triggered by sounds or glimpses. And sometimes you have the feeling that somebody is following you. On this particular occasion, I started to get very strongly that feeling. Now there was a little bit of moonlight. It wasn't completely full moon, but it was nearly a full moon. It was a bit low on the horizon, but occasionally there were shafts of light flooded across a road. And I decided to stop after one of these lit areas so that I was in the dark and whatever was following me might become visible. So I slowed down and hopped off and looked back. And at the full distance of my vision, I saw 2 little red dots. And they weren't far wide to be brake lights of a car. There was no car on those country roads at that time. I would have heard it. I had very good hearing then. I could hear the bats clicking when they were circling, and owls from miles away. I don't have that good hearing now, but then I did. And I noticed that these 2 red lights were getting closer and were not moving evenly, undulating slightly, like something was moving. And that started to get me quite worried. I mounted very carefully and quietly my bike. I was fully in the darkness. I didn't think whatever it was could see me. And I realized it's not someone that is looking at me or following me. It's something. I started to move off on the bike. There's a slight slope there. Looking back to see as this thing entered the lit area with the moonlight. The terrifying sight that as it entered that light, it cast a shadow in the moonlight. I could see how big this thing was. 6 foot tall at least. I was then just under 6 foot. It was at least as tall as me, and it was a four-legged creature of some kind. Black as the ace of spades. You could almost not see it. It was so dark, no detail at least, but I saw the eyes, and I was, at that point, with my good vision, 2020, I could see they were eyes. They were not red lights or something like that. And that was enough for me to start moving. And I've never moved more quickly from gear 1 to gear 5 in my life. Fortunately, there was a slight slope. I was able to accelerate pretty fast. I could not help but keep looking back. It's a straight road, to see if this thing was going to start running, and it started moving much more quickly. I couldn't hear its feet as it was moving. You normally hear this scamper of a dog's feet when it starts moving, especially on tarmac. I couldn't hear that, but I could hear it growl. What was the distance? Maybe 30 yards, 40 yards, something like that. I very quickly got up speed. Must have been going 25 miles an hour, something like that, moving towards 30. So I took a next bend and took one more glimpse before the next straight came, and it was obviously closing on me quite quickly, maybe only 20 yards behind me. I could hear its growl even louder now, and then I really started to give everything I had. I knew that road quite well. We'd taken it on the way to Leaston Abbey, and I knew that there was a couple of hills in between, but if you took them fast enough on one, you could get quite quickly up the next one, and there was exactly that dip coming up. I hoped a car would come. There was a small hamlet of 2 or 3 houses further down. There was a lamppost. I hoped maybe someone would be around. I must have been now approaching 30-35 miles an hour, as fast as I could probably do on a flat, and coming up to that rather steep down and unfortunately a hill going up. I took some breath as I came to the downward slope and gave it everything I could. I must have been over 40 when I hit the base of it. I went through some water that had collected there. Splashed in all directions. Slowed me down a little bit, but I probably was maybe 45 miles an hour. I was going like almost at the point that I couldn't stay on the bike. Very dangerous. Don't like. But what behind me was much more dangerous. Put my head down on the razor, gave it every piece of energy I had to try and keep that speed going up. But of course I slowed down. 40, 38, 33, 30. I could hear it. And I picked up something else, an odour, a terrible, horrifying odour. like the stink and draft out of a slaughterhouse. It was close. It was close. As I reached the peak of the hill, maybe I was back to 25 miles an hour, and I was shifting through the gears to try and pick up that speed rapidly. I took one further look back, maybe 10 yards behind me now. I could see its teeth. Large, very large teeth, as long as my fingers at least. The moonlight caught them and they flashed fiercely. I could see its red mouth and I could see its eyes focused on me. I was getting tired, but somehow I drew from within me more adrenaline. And thank God, from the top of that hill there was a slope going all the way down to Alderburgh, to the vicarage cottage. Passing through, as I said, a small hamlet. There was a lamp there, but I could see no one was around. There weren't even lights on in the houses. If I screamed, it wouldn't do me any good. I picked up speed. Now it was very close behind me, 5 yards probably. I could hear it. I could hear it growling. I couldn't hear its feet. Its ghostly feet somehow made no sound. But I could smell it. That hideous choking. It almost poisoned me that I couldn't take the air in. I gave one last effort. Now maybe I was a mile away from some kind of safety. At least maybe nobody was at home, because I know my friend had gone out and his mother planned something that evening. I had the key that they gave me. I just had to get behind those big oak vicarage doors. Now the vicar had told me a story about the vicarage and those doors. Those doors were taken off a British man of the line. So a four-rigger ship from the late 1700s, and they were 6-inch oak, and they were panelled together with wrought iron supports. And I knew at that part of the house there were no windows in the entranceway, that I would be, once behind those doors, some kind of safety, I thought. Well, I was becoming very exhausted, but I must have picked up to nearly again 40 miles an hour, giving it everything I could in top gear. 2 or 3 yards behind me was this creature. We passed the lamppost and the small hamlet. I didn't look back. I had to just focus on speed and getting to safety. There I saw it, just the end of the road, maybe 100 yards away now, the vicarage and the door and this faint light next to the entrance. I started to prepare and clutched the key. Maybe they left the door open and I could get inside quickly. Maybe not. As we got closer to the vicarage and the church, I had the impression that my pursuant had slowed a little bit, realizing that he was approaching consecrated ground. Maybe this gave me a few more yards, a little bit more time. My legs ached as never before. I did a lot of sport when I was young, but I'd never taken my body to this limit. There was some gravel just before the door of the vicarage, and I realised I'd had to slow down and somehow do everything all at once. My only chance. Well, I'd gained a little bit distance. Maybe the hound of hell had slowed a little bit before thinking to approach these holy places. But we know from history that he was prepared to even enter a church. I turned off to the vicarage. There was gravel everywhere. Of course, I lost control and slid with the bike all the way to the door and thumped against it. But I kept my senses, kicked the bike away in the direction of the hound, who was very visible. Most terrifying sight I've ever seen. 6 foot tall, a huge head, gigantic teeth, and looking at me and slowing as an animal does before it wishes to pounce. I had the key in my hand and had reached already up and put it in the latch. It opened and thumped the door open and tried to gain my standing position to get in. The animal came closer and closer. I just got around the other side of the door and slammed it shut when an almighty thump hit the door and pushed me back. I managed to press against the door and with all my strength almost closed it until a giant paw reached around the door and clasped it right next to my face. This paw must have been the size of my head. I had to think quickly, very quickly. I couldn't beat him on strength. He had twice my weight, 5 times my strength. But a short, sharp pain I could inflict. I gave and let the door come open slightly, and then with all the strength I had, whatever was left in my legs, I thumped it on his leg and paw. There was an almighty howl from out the other side of the door, and he withdrew this menacing, deadly, razor-sharp paw, just giving me a fraction of a second that I could pull the door to and put the latches across, all 4 of them, in the middle and under, and lock the door. Again, a mighty thump hit the door, which knocked me back. This time I lost my balance and was on my back. And Black Shuck was pressing on the door. I realised there was very little now I could do. That fall had knocked the breath out of me, and I stared at the door. and started to pray every prayer I knew that the door would hold. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not fear. This and 20 other prayers I recited in just a minute. I watched as the oak door started to form a depression moving towards me. It started to bulge. He pressed, and I could hear his growl, and he pressed, and then it stopped for a second. I began to think, has he given up? He can't get through this oak door. It will hold. And then he pressed again, and howled and howled, and the door bulged and started to splinter. I could hear it. 200-year-old oak beams were giving way. There was the wrought iron support struts across the door. They would hold it, I thought. They started to bulge and bend. One of the bolts on the wrought iron suddenly flew across the room and given up its hold of centuries. And I thought, this may be it. This may be it. I looked around the room for any kind of weapon that I could use. I had a small pocket knife, took it out, and I stood up and said, "Okay, Black Shuck, come on in, I'm ready for you." In a foolish last belief of defiance and hope. And then, at that moment, I saw the cross above the door. Of course, this was a vicarage, a very large silver cross above his door. I leapt to the door, took it off its hook, and slammed it in the middle of the door, and almost immediately there was a horrendous howl, a howl of pain and fear, a howl of shock, a howl of fear from the hound, who immediately backed off, and the door beams fell back into their rightful place. The beams had held. They may have splitted in one or two places, and one of the wrought iron struts was almost from its hinge, but it had held. But what above all had held the hound away from me was the crucifix. I heard him growl in discontent as he backed off. I thought he was going. I couldn't hear his paws on the gravel. I pressed my ear to the door with the cross pressed against it. Bang!
One last swipe he took at the door. Bang! As if to say, maybe this time, but next time I'll have you. And I heard him recede rapidly, growling, moaning that he had not captured his prey that night. And I fell to my knees with the cross against the door and gasped for breath and fell to the floor, clutching the cross, and thank God that I was still alive. Almost comatose, lying on the floor. All three had come back with his son and his wife, and they picked me up and took me into the kitchen and gave me some brandy. I couldn't stop trembling for half an hour. Very calmly, the Reverend lit his pipe. The fire was going. I was warming up. And he didn't say anything. His door was almost ruined, I thought. And who would ever believe this story? Who? But nevertheless, I started to tell him what happened. Of course, my friend confirmed that we were at Leiston Abbey and he had left early. At least that part of the story was undisputed. Well, after I was finished and had drank half a bottle of brandy, still clutching the cross, he said, "It's all right, my boy. You're safe now. You're safe. You go to bed now. Take the cross with you. I want you to keep it. It's been blessed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it did save your life." The next day we inspected the damage to the door. Well, in fact it could be fixed up. We replaced the wrought iron support and we planed it down where there were splitters, but the burn marks, those paws and claws on the outside of the door, every time we shaved them away they reappeared, until he brought a bottle of holy water and let it wash over there, that surface that was so desecrated, and before our very eyes those marks disappeared. Not entirely, but only someone who knew this story would recognize what they were. I wish you a pleasant evening, and if you are thinking of taking a cycle trip this evening, maybe do it another time in daylight. Good night, everyone.
you.